Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad that you're here for the Orcas Island Public Library program of the night. We have Ben Montgomery, author, and we also have Jens Kruse, who will be doing the Q&A and also wrote a review of the book in the Orcasonian. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly introduce Jens. I'm sure you all know who he is anyhow, but the information I have here is that he received his doctorate in comparative literature at UCLA, taught German language and literature at Wellesley College for over 30 years, and he has a particular interest in Goethe, and currently serves as our library board of trustee and believes that libraries are an essential institution to help us preserve democracy. So take it away, Jens Kruse.
Thank you, Red. So I'll just give a very brief introduction of Ben Montgomery, and because I want him to have as much time as possible for his presentation and then for the Q&A. And so Ben has worked in long-form narrative journalism for a long time, first for a medium-sized paper in New York State, the Times Herald Record, then at the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, which then morphed into the Tampa Bay Times. There he did reporting and writing on the, among many other things, on the Dozier Reform School for Boys, which won him a Pulitzer finalist citation. That material has recently been used by Colton Whitehead for a sort of novel version of that, which I think is called The Nickel Boys. And I joked with Ben the other day that Colton Whitehead apparently has received a Pulitzer. And I joked with him that it seems wrong that the derivative version gets a Pulitzer and the original version didn't. But hey, Pulitzer finalist is not something to sneer at all. Ben has written 4 books, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, The Leper Spy, The Man Who Walked Backward, and now A Shot in the Moonlight, the book he'll talk to us about. If you ask yourself how someone can be a working journalist and at the same time write many books, it needs to be stated that for a while there, Ben left the Tampa Bay Times and didn't do day-to-day journalism anymore, but he has just recently become the lead journalist for a new venture by Axios, Axios Tampa. So he's back to being both a day-to-day journalist and an author. And I'm grateful that Ben has agreed to make the time to be with us and talk about his book. And with that, I will just turn it over to Ben. And Ben, do your thing.
Thank you very much, Jens. And thank you to the Orcas Island Library for having me. This is a great treat. I wish I could be there in person. I had the good fortune of visiting Jens and Susan a couple of years ago in 2018 when my last book came out, and the good people at the library played host to a little event, which was just wonderful. And we had a nice meal afterwards and spent a few good days on the island. We took a walk as well, which I'm fondly recall, Jens. I can't remember where that was, but around a lake up there.
Around Mountain Lake, as I recall.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'll give you the spiel on this book, and then maybe I could read a little bit for you, not a lot, because I never enjoy hearing authors read. I like hearing voice actors read, but I've never really liked hearing authors read. So I'll read a small portion of this just to give you a flavor of how the book is written. But I'll tell you the story first. In 1897, a freed enslaved person who was born into slavery in 1855, named George Denning, was asleep inside of his cabin with his wife and about half of his 11 children. late one night, cold January night, 1897, and 25 white men, most of them his neighbors, who were all bearing arms, or 3/4 of them bearing arms, rode up on horseback to his cabin and approached his house on the lawn and shouted to him, waking him up from a slumber, shouted at him to come outside, that they wanted to talk to him. And he refused to open the door. He tried to ask who they were, and they refused to say. He said, "What have I done wrong?" And the spokesman for the group said, "Well, we know that you've been stealing some chickens and some livestock from neighboring farms, and you're up to no good. And so come out here, and we need to talk to you." And he refused. And during this commotion, probably because of his obstinance and his refusal to come outside, someone fired a shot into the back door of the house, maybe more than one shot. And so the folks on the front lawn began firing into the cabin as well. And all this commotion, George Dinning grabbed his own rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, and started to run up the stairs. And it's important to say that this happened in 1897, which was about 5 years after the famous muckraking journalist Ida B. Wells, whose printing presses had been destroyed, who had witnessed a number of lynchings in and around Memphis, Tennessee, who wrote unceasingly about the plight of Black men and women in the South. She wrote in an editorial famously that the Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home to provide the protection which the law refuses to provide. She was encouraging freed men and women, Black men and women, to take up arms, to defend themselves, because the law, more often than not, was not on their side. They were either passive or actively engaged in oppressing the people of color. And so this was a solution for Ida B. Wells. We don't know why George Dinning had a gun that night, but he did live in a part of the state of Kentucky that was plagued by racial violence on a regular basis, including Klan lynchings and sadism and barbarism when it came to white people murdering Black people. And it was like clockwork in the South in 1897. There was a resurgence of violence at the end of the Gilded Age, and nobody knew exactly what to do about it or how to stop it. But the governor of Kentucky, who I'll talk about in a little bit, came up with a pretty good idea. Anyways, George Dinning wakes up, refuses to come out. The firing starts. He grabs his own shotgun and starts to run upstairs, this little hand-built 2-story cabin that he had built himself. And he took a bullet in the left arm, grazed his arm, continues upstairs, gets to the window, throws open the shutters, sees just for a moment, briefly, down below, the men standing in his yard with their guns drawn. And he leans out just far enough, and he takes a bullet right in the forehead. It just grazes his forehead, travels under the skin, and then exits on the top of his head. At the same time, he pulls off a shot. He squeezes the trigger. He retreats back into the house, fled out the back door, hid out in some weeds until the coast was clear and he heard the men retreat, then returned to his house and collected his boots and his coat and his hat from his wife, and then took off. Unbeknownst to him at that time, his shot had struck and killed the 32-year-old scion of the wealthiest farm family in southwestern Kentucky, a man named Jody Kahn, who had a lot of friends. And he fell dead on George Dinning's lawn that night. When Dinning learns this the next morning, he turns himself into the sheriff. And this was a remarkable thing. At that time, turning yourself into the sheriff, oftentimes you might as well be turning yourself into the lynch mob. The sheriffs were very passive, often would just, hand the prisoner to the mob, turn over the keys to the jail and so forth. And so when George Dinning turned himself in, it was the first time that he really had to trust the system. And it turns out Sheriff Bud Clark was a civil servant who was honest and had some integrity, and learned that a mob was gathering to try to raid the local jail, to kidnap George Dinning and lynch him. And so the sheriff secreted George Dinning off at nighttime, took him by carriage to Bowling Green, Kentucky, a short 20 miles or so away, where Dinning was put in prison. The mob was continuing to come after him. the jailer in Bowling Green, in fact, his only defense against the mob was to arm the other prisoners who were there to protect Denning. And so he did that. The mob never wound up raiding the jail, but maybe because he had armed the prisoners and word got out about that. Meanwhile, back home, back in Simpson County, Kentucky, the mob returned some of those same white men who had been at George Denning's house the night before. They returned to the home and held hostage his wife and his children, hoping that Denning might come back to the house and they could get him. When he didn't come back late that evening, they demanded that his wife take her children on 2 horses and ride 50 miles without stopping. They said, don't stop until you get well across the state line. And so she did this. She had a sick child, but loaded everybody up onto these 2 horses and some meager possessions and headed off and wound up staying with some family in Blackjack, Tennessee. Meanwhile, Denning was spirited to Louisville, where he was safer. Louisville was a more progressive city, certainly a more robust, larger Black population. And it was more metropolitan in the sense that there wasn't that kind of violence, certainly on the outskirts, but not a lot at that time in Louisville proper. And so Denning was kept there for about 6 months and then returned to Simpson County, where he faced trial for murder. And in order to bring charges against George Denning for murder, the important thing to note was some of the men in the mob that night had to out themselves because they were the only witnesses to to the killing of Jody Kahn. So they were the only people who could offer testimony that was evidence enough to bring charges against Denning. So to secure that indictment, these guys had to step forward, and it took them about 3 months to do so as they considered whether that was a good idea. So they finally did agree to testify, and in front of an all-white jury, they told the remarkable story that they were there that night in order to have a talk with their friend. They were not intending any violence. They wanted to ask him some questions about stealing livestock from a neighboring farm. And if he was guilty, they might have driven him away, but they told the jury they had no intent to harm him. The defense attorney pointed out that 3/4 of them were carrying weapons that night. And he asked many of them, do you carry weapons when you go at midnight to visit your friends, to have a conversation? So he tried very hard, but justice often was elusive, especially for people of color in that era in local courts. And it was that case for George Denning, who was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter, which was notable as well. The jury came off of the murder charge and wound up convicting him of manslaughter, and they sentenced him to 7 years hard time in state prison. And he was dispatched almost immediately. This verdict was sensational across the state of Kentucky. Hundreds of people began to write letters to the governor demanding he pardon George Denning. The Castle Doctrine, the belief in the Castle Doctrine, which has been with us for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, was more powerful than probably perceived racism or bias at the time in Kentucky. And so men and women, Black and white, from all walks of life, wrote letters to the governor protesting the conviction and asking the governor to pardon Denning. Included in those people was a former colonel from the Confederate Army, a guy named Bennett Young, who had been paying attention to the case in the Louisville newspapers and saw what was up. He was a lawyer. He was well known in Louisville. He was wealthy. He was a bit of a Renaissance man. He collected antiques, and he wrote many books of history. He delivered wonderful speeches that everybody turned out to hear. He was a railroad investor. He was a builder. And he took a keen interest in the case of George Denning. And he wrote a telegram to the governor saying, don't let the sun set on today before George Denning is pardoned and released from jail. And so whoever's letter worked, the governor wound up seeing the light. And immediately after Denning arrived in Eddyville, Kentucky, he sent word to the jailer to pardon Denning, and he gave him a one-way train ticket to Louisville. I think I failed to mention that when the mob drove the family off, Molly and the kids, they set fire to George Denning's home and to his barn and to his fields and to his gear house. So he had nothing back in Simpson County to return to, not to mention the mob still would have been riled up, especially since he had been pardoned. The first Black man in the South that I could find that had ever been pardoned by a governor for killing a white person. So Denning went on to Louisville, and he was celebrated in Louisville, especially among the people of color in Louisville. He was invited to deliver speeches at churches and at fraternal organizations. The churches often took offerings for him, and they were typically pretty healthy collections. They would just give the money to Denning to try to get him back on his feet. And word started to get out around that time as he's, being lionized around town. Word started to get out that he was planning to file a federal lawsuit against the members of the lynch mob for destroying his property. And that he was going to file it with the help of a white lawyer named Bennett Young in federal court, and that they were going to sue for $50,000 in damages, which is equivalent today to about $1.5 million. We don't know exactly what happened in this instance because no charges were ever brought. I could find no police records that indicated there was any kind of investigation into this event, but I did find medical records that support the fact that George Denning wound up in the hospital and spent 6 or 7 days recovering from a broken skull and a contused eye. Somebody had his eye was out of his socket when he arrived at the hospital. But late one night, people found George Denning in a street in an alleyway in Louisville, and beat him over the head with a brick, gouged out one of his eyes, and left him for dead. He didn't die. He recovered at the hospital and charged forward with the filing of this lawsuit with the help of Bennett Young, his Confederate war hero. So eventually the mob was tried. And if I told you what happened at this trial, you wouldn't read the book. So I'm just going to leave that tease there for you and tell you that this story appealed to me in such a big way because of the courage displayed by George Denning. And in researching his story and his legacy, I wound up meeting a handful of his family members, including his great-grandson, Anthony Denning, who I now consider a friend. And Anthony and his family helped me understand that in this case, even though things turned out okay for George Denning, at least when it came to seeking justice in court, that he never got true justice. The white men involved in that never paid him back. He collected a little bit of money here and there, but many of them were successful in convincing the court that they were indigent and didn't have any money to give him. But nonetheless, he tried for the next 20 years to get them to pay up. So they were at a minimum plagued by continuing court filings and lawsuits that they were forced then to respond to really for the rest of many of their natural lives. One of the men who was there that night, a spokesman for the group, was named Doc Moore. And one Christmas, the year after George Denning was pardoned, and the year after he had successfully sued the mob in federal court. There, I just told you the ending. One of these men who had lost the lawsuit took his own life, and the reporters at the local newspapers around his hometown there in Simpson County reported that he had gone mad and that he was saying that he was being chased by devils, and this is what haunted him right up into his suicide. So the Dennings relocated to Indiana, just across the Ohio River from Louisville, where they lived in a town called Jeffersonville. Many of them are still there. They changed their last name from Denning, D-I-N-N-I-N-G, to D-E-N-N-I-N-G, and not even the family knows why George Denning would have done that. It could have been to eschew his slave name. It could have been to avoid the press. Could have been for any number of reasons, but he changed his name, the spelling of their names. And eventually George Denning died in 1930 of natural causes. Because of what he left and what he was able to build in Indiana, his son, built the first, his son built and moved into a house on a street called Spring Street in Jeffersonville. And they were the first Black family to live on Spring Street, which was a point of pride for them. And that family still owns that house on Spring Street. A lot of people, I'll just preempt this, a lot of people ask why I chose to write this book or how I found this story. It deals with my time at the newspaper. I was working at the Tampa Bay Times, and my swan song there was a project that took about 3 years and tried to account for 6 years of police shootings in the state of Florida, which was something that nobody counted before we decided to do this project. So we asked 400 police agencies, every law enforcement agency in the state, for 6 years worth of police shooting reports. And then we analyzed them and wound up writing a couple of stories about what we learned. One of the most important factors was that 40% of the people shot by police, and there was 828 people in that 6-year period in Florida. 40% of them were Black. And that compares with the population, the Black population in the state is about 15%. So that was out of whack for us. And in the process of reporting that, I wound up connecting with this group of Black mothers. All of them had lost husbands or children to police violence. And so I'm thinking deeply about this and really kind of connecting with the plight of these women who, many of them, their loved one was killed years ago, and they still try to pursue justice in any way they know how, including standing on street corners holding signs that bear the names of their dead sons and husbands. And so I was living this story in my day job. And because the book stuff during that time was always extracurricular, I was looking for something better that might not be so full of tragedy and so perpetually sad. And so I started doing some searching in newspaper archives for stories that might scratch that itch, where someone had almost been a victim, or maybe they had been a victimized in a certain way. And then they decided in an era when it was unlikely, they decided to go in pursuit of justice or even vengeance. And I found that after looking for a long while, I found that in this George Dinning story. I had never heard of it. It felt new to me. I didn't mention this, but Bennett Young, the guy who successfully represented Dinning in court, while he fought for the Confederacy and would have died for the Confederacy. In fact, he led the northernmost land action in the Civil War, was a Confederate raid from Canada into New Albans, Vermont. And Bennett Young led that raid. But after the war, he's this proud son of the South, did more than any contemporary toward promoting the idea, the myth of the lost cause, and holding up the sometimes fictitious chivalry of the Southern soldier. He wrote a 600-page book called Wizards of the Confederate Saddle, where he really just spends the whole time honoring, writing in these purple sort of ways, the chivalry of his Confederate brothers. And so he also raised money to build statues. He delivered keynotes at the unveilings of very important statues that we're now trying to determine the future of, that some of them have already been removed and some of them torn down. Well, that all happened in the early 20th century, 1900 to 1920, which is the end of the life of Bennett Young, who led the Confederate Veterans Home and was dear friends with Minnie Davis, Jefferson Davis's daughter. Jeff Davis was the president of the Confederacy. And so you have this guy with a mixed legacy. On one hand, he founded and was president of a Black orphanage, and he represented pro bono men and women like George Dinning in court in important cases like this, groundbreaking cases. And then this guy who did so much, who dedicated his life to promoting the South and the idea of the Confederacy, and trying to erase the notion that it was that their motivation was connected to slavery. So at some point, he may have had a change of heart. He may have just seen the light. It may have been economic. He had, serious economic interest in the city of Louisville and in Kentucky in general, with his railroad investments and his other business enterprises. They all realized, smart politicians realized at the time, that nobody's going to come to the state of Kentucky. Nobody's going to move to the state of Kentucky if we don't stop this racial violence, which was so widespread. And so perhaps that had something to do with Bennett Young's motivation or his change in life. But whatever the case, he remains a very interesting character to me. And I found in this story some redemption that I think is worth celebrating, even if things didn't work out really great for George Denning after this case was over. He did win. He found his nugget of justice. I try to make the argument that it's upon the bones of forgotten people like George Denning and others from that era when all history is white. Civil War to the sustained civil rights movements, very white history. And so, we would do well to remember these heroes, because the civil rights leaders that we celebrate in February that came after him, they're in some way standing on the courage that he displayed, that cold night in January 1897, and then for the next few years as he pursued justice against the odds in civil court. And let me just read a short passage, and I'll take some questions if you have them. By the way, there were 166 people were lynched without trial in the last 25 years of the 19th century in Kentucky. The numbers were much higher in deep South states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, but Kentucky was far worse than the other border states when it came to racist lynchings. So it happened pretty regularly. That's not the passage I was going to read. I was going to read you this. This is just the page 1, first chapter. January 21st, 1897. When the guns fell silent and the white men took cover, George Denning burst out the back of his little wooden house wearing only his undergarments. He ran through the frigid January air, and when he reached the tall grass of a nearby field, he hurled himself down flat on his back, his lungs heaving, his breath visible and rising beneath a moon almost full and what seemed to be a million stars poking through a smoky blue-black midnight sky. He lay still and quiet and listened to the men's voices coming from the north beyond the house. They sounded at first as though they were in a state of consternation, but the voices grew distant as time slid by, suggesting retreat. When he could no longer hear the voices over the heartbeat in his own ears, he sat up slowly, looked around, then darted across the field toward his house. His wife met him at the door with his boots, his heavy coat, and his hat, and he dressed quickly without saying much, then turned away from the humble home he had built with his own hands, the only home his children had ever known, the home he had defended, and he disappeared into the darkness. And I am more than happy to answer any questions or start a conversation.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
First of all, I'm extremely eager to read the book. Having read Jens's review some days ago and hearing you read that compelling introduction, it's really, or the introductory paragraphs. It's ironic to me that he would have wound up in Indiana, because Indiana became kind of a hotbed of Ku Klux Klan activity.
That's right.
And it's also ironic to me that you wound up in Florida now, because I read a few years back about the accounts of how common lynchings were in Florida. I think more than any other state in the South during the early part of the century.
Certainly, in terms of lynchings per capita, yes, sir.
Right. Yeah. And so, but obviously the most fascinating thing that you bring up is Bennett Young's apparently working both sides of his conscience. And it strikes me, though, that for someone who believed, as many I understand in the Confederacy did, that it wasn't about slavery.
Right.
It just makes me wonder if it might not be true that for a large part of the Confederacy, and even those who were fighting in it, it may have been about some aspect of Southern life or culture that they were defending, and that some of them were not committed to slavery. And if so, and I'll wrap it with this, that it's not inconsistent, if that was his true belief, that he would do something to evidence his looking out for an African-American person who was being wronged.
Right. Yeah, and unfortunately, out of all the material that Bennett Young, left behind, including a half dozen books and histories, the historic record that I'm able to access does not indicate how he came down on that issue. And I think what's interesting in this ongoing discussion, very important discussion that we're having about how we remember the Confederacy. I came across an editorial in the New York Times in 1864 as the Civil War raged. And by the way, it's important to remember this interesting fact that I just saw the other day. And boy, I hope I don't mess up the numbers. In between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, 7 Southern states seceded. So before Lincoln even took office, these states had decided, long before the Emancipation Proclamation, these states had decided, they predicted the future and decided they were going to secede. And that was to support the system of slavery. There's no question, because all of them were slave states. And so if you were in a border state, say like Kentucky, you had the choice. You could choose the Union or the Confederacy. We know that Bennett Young grew up with slaves. His father was a wealthy businessman, and they had a plantation on the outskirts of town in Jessamine County, Kentucky. And so he grew up with a half dozen slaves, workers on the farm. I left this train of thought, but 1864 editorial in the New York Times, it says, "There will come a day in the distant future when we look back, when humans look back on this period of time, and slavery seems as barbaric to them as the Italian gladiators do to us right now." Follow that?
Yeah.
And he says, and those people from the future will judge the politicians of our day on one thing: how they came down on that great moral issue of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurs to me that that's the moment we're in right now. We have, there's not a lot of room for complications in character, it seems, when the debate is so passionate, which is why I think Bennett Young is interesting, because he has character complications, and, because it's a bit of a mystery how he felt about things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's anyone's guess. But yeah, that absolutely could be the case. You could be in his shoes and believe 100% that this was a states' rights issue.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of that was from, apologists, Confederate apologists, who tried to introduce the idea that it was about states' rights long after the war was over,
And one could argue still are arguing.
What's that?
And one could argue there are many who still are arguing that states' rights issue.
Oh yeah,
without
for sure.
confessing to the racist side of the argument.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I write in the introduction, and this is totally stolen from Hannah Nicole Jones, who's shepherded that interesting project for the New York Times called the 1619 Project.
Mm-hmm.
she said, the Civil War never ended. We might have called it off. We're not holding muskets and running across the fields outside of Gettysburg, but we're still fighting it on Facebook and, in high school hallways and, the soldiers are sometimes, police with no knock warrants and corrupt judges and the Proud Boys and, open outfits like that. But, anyways, I think there's some truth to that. And I think, honestly, January 6th was sort of, the shining example that like, we're actually still doing this, because there were obviously racist undertones throughout the 4 years President Trump was in office. In fact, he stood in front of, I was thinking about this, it's in the introduction too. He stood on July 4th in front of Mount Rushmore and delivered this very coded white supremacist speech. If you remember this, it's on YouTube if you want to look it up. So interesting, but everything is coded. We can't let them take our history, that sort of language. And he's standing in front of Mount Rushmore, which, there are two guys on there who were slaveholders, very clearly, well known, well documented. So what a fascinating point in history, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty revealing what the Republican Party, the shenanigans they played through 8 years of Obama's time in office. It's clearly, it was, if not
With the birtherism and
yeah.
Yeah.
It was overt, it was covert, it was in every way they could. They, carried that flag, that Confederate flag.
right.
It wasn't just about being conservative at all. You could be
Right.
conservative and not be the way they were.
Yeah. Yeah. And that there were, no small number of Confederate flags on January 6th,
Right.
on the steps of the Capitol.
Including one that got into the White House.
Yeah. Wild.
So, Ben, was there something in the heritage between the people who settled the Kentucky area and the people who settled the deep south of Mississippi and Georgia, and that made it slightly more progressive for this specific situation you wrote in your book?
Well, it was closer to the Mason-Dixon line. That was the biggest thing. It also is bordered on, two sides essentially by the Ohio River, which was a shipping channel. And I think you'll find that geographically, a lot of towns along shipping channels were sort of happened to be more metropolitan and open-minded. You see that in Cincinnati, especially French cities established like Cincinnati and Louisville. St. Louis, but Kentucky itself, was and is an interesting state, close to the Mason-Dixon line. So it was the end of the Trail of Tears. So Louisville wound up with a really healthy Black population because a lot of people decided they had reached a safe city and they chose not to, be shuttled across the Ohio River to actually make it to the north. And for that reason, it had a politically powerful Black bloc in the 1890s. I don't know. That's a great question. Kentucky was kind of was not super close to a port, and I think probably the slave population you would notice would be smaller than it was in a lot of states that were deeper into the South, because you had to actually travel sometimes to Nashville or to New Orleans in order to get slaves. And so while some were brought with the first settlers who crossed the Appalachians through the Cumberland Gap and made their way into Kentucky, the original Black population was not very big. And the Black population never got quite as big as some of the states further south. Interestingly, it was not at first. After the Civil War, when the freedmen's bureaus were set up in southern states to provide freed men and women access to government services, essentially, and to protection occasionally. They did not set up a freedmen's bureau in Kentucky because it was a border state and it had never officially seceded. So the freedmen's bureaus were only distributed to states that had actually seceded. And so some of the black men and women in Kentucky after the war who were still dealing with the white violence had nowhere to turn because there were no freedmen's bureaus through which they could seek relief or law enforcement protection. And so it took the black people of Kentucky begging the federal government to open a freedmen's bureau for them to finally do it. And it didn't come until sometime after the war had ended.
Didn't know such a thing.
Yeah. And interestingly, talking about, sort of organized violence, and especially the organized violence that would come later to Kentucky. But the Klan, the KKK, was technically established in Pulaski, Tennessee, which is not far south of the Kentucky border and not far south of Simpson County, Kentucky, where George Denning, was born and raised. And there's no evidence that these guys who rode up to his house were technically a part of the Klan. They were just, a band of neighbors, a mob of neighbors, if you will, but they weren't wearing hoods or anything like that. But the Klan presence all sort of started right there in Pulaski, Tennessee, and then spread geographically to, surrounding larger cities, and then eventually into the rural towns, and so forth.
Ben, one thing I found interesting in your book, I think you use the term regulators to describe white groups like that. And I had never heard that term before, but I guess it meant people who self-appointed themselves to regulate the right kind of relationship between whites and blacks, or
right. And sometimes it was actually a legal distinction. So it was a power that the sheriff could bestow upon some newly deputized, group of peacekeepers is the other word for it. But, they would enforce the law. So they didn't have the authority of a paid police officer, but they were hired or, sometimes volunteered, dispatched to enforce the law and to regulate. And often they were kind of more vigilantes than anything. But yeah, they were called a number of things: regulators, white cappers, mobsters. But that name stuck, regulators.
Ben, do you know this whole coming to his place with guns and all this? What do you think really actually did precipitate this? Unless they really thought he was stealing, or what was it? Was some other cause, or was he just?
Yeah. We can only guess, but it was not uncommon at that time and in that area, and really across the South, for some threat of violence to dislodge a black family so that the local whites could take their property. And so, even if they didn't really have the intention of lynching him when they showed up, and if you assume that gunshot in the back door was maybe on accident and that started all the chaos and confusion, at a minimum, they had shown up to demand he leave his property and get 50 miles away before stopping. And that is just theft, that is stealing this man's property. A guy did a investigative reporter for the Associated Press, did a Pulitzer Prize winning series a few years ago where he looked at census data from like the 1880s all the way through the 1940s in the South. And he compared them, they're taken every 10 years, of course, but he compared the years and he looked for counties that had like completely lost their black population and, had been, let's say 40 or 50% black one year. And then the next year, 2%. These big dramatic swings in 10-year periods of the black population. And he found that every time that there was a huge drop in black population in a county, it had come right after some intense public violence, racial violence, that was meant to send a message to everyone that you're not safe here or you're not welcome here. And so I think, there's a fair case to be made that that's what they were intending. They had visited the homes of other Black men in the area, but they had not come at any of them in the way that they did at George Denning. So
Do you think they had some systematic way of trying to apportion this property among themselves? It was kind of bizarre that they'd be that, were they organized, or was it just like, who would, how would they decide who would get the property? Is there any kind of system to it, or it was just this?
Well, there were two brothers, the Flowers brothers, who owned adjacent property. It's guesswork, but that having George Denning's 114 acres would have brought their farms together. So, who knows though?
Pam,
Yeah.
Pam, you wanted to?
Yes, I'm taking the other side here. Did the outcome of all of these events send a message of hope or encouragement to the Black community to stand up for themselves? Is there any particular evidence or incidents?
You mean after
Yeah.
he won the court case?
Yeah.
There is, and I recount a couple of instances in the book that came shortly after George Denning found success in federal court, and they were similar situations. One was a man, I believe, who had been publicly beaten by there's a Black man who had been publicly beaten by a white man for whom he was working. And he brought a lawsuit and was successful in court as well, for whatever it was, damages of some sort. And then there's another anecdote that is kind of complicated, but I get into it in the book a little bit. So at a minimum, two cases almost immediately after George Denning's case that came up in court, and and the ruling was in the favor of the person of color. So you got to think that sends a message. I don't know. As sensational as the Denning case was, it was covered by papers across the country. The New York Times hired a correspondent to cover it. It was a big deal. If you were a reading citizen, you would have probably seen a story about George Denning on the front page of your local paper. That's how out of the norm it was and how sensational it was. So outside of that, I can only guess at the effects it had, but it didn't stop mob violence. In fact, in 1915, there was another resurgence. The Second Klan was born. That was organized immediately to once again try to establish white supremacy, in the face of growing rights for men and women of color.
Well, we live in Minnesota, and we had lynching in Duluth in the 1920s. So
yeah,
it's ongoing. I find this very fascinating because my great-grandfather left North Carolina with his father's permission to go west. He was a younger son. He wouldn't inherit the tobacco farm. And he did go west, but he mostly went north with himself and his people. And when they crossed the Ohio, he had letters of emancipation for all of them.
wow.
And offered them wage for life if they'd stay and help him farm in Indiana, but most of them took their freedom, and he understood and gave them full permission.
Yeah.
But when the war broke out and he was summoned home and he refused to go, the letter came back, "You and yours are forever dead." And
Wow.
that persists to today.
How interesting.
And I find that just astonishing that people can be that harsh.
Yeah, for sure. And yet I feel like that's not a foreign sentiment today. Even now, there's still feelings that are that strong among certain parts of the population. That is wild. What a story. I remember my grandfather showing me a picture of, I believe, his own grandfather, maybe his great grandfather. And there were 6 brothers, and 2 of them fought for the South and 4 of them fought for the North. So when they say this, really, it was brother versus brother, like here was an example of, in my ancestry, of brothers fighting brothers, standing on opposite side of the line. Just
Well,
wild to think about.
I mean, it's interesting that quite a few of the people who are being have been indicted for the January 6th event were turned in by friends and family. I mean,
Right.
they were identified and located via sort of tips from people they know. So
Right.
so it still goes on. We all, even families, aren't cohesive.
Yeah, it's true.
So Ben, Ben, as far as the KKK goes, the formation of that, I must confess, I'm not up on the details of it. Just broadly, that it was maybe a reaction to the North coming in and controlling some things and trying to establish some white supremacy, white power and so on and so on. But do you think this kind of case with Denning and others like that had any influence on people saying, well, we need to get more organized and fight back, or was there some of that going on too?
Well, that had been the case for a long time. So I don't think the Denning case sort of promoted that sort of banding together to organizing to regulate. In fact, one of the parts of this book that I had an interesting time studying, or I thought was super interesting, was a couple of books that I read that had to do with the history of American policing, and the idea that the northern police departments are all begat by this sort of British system of policing, the Watchman system, where it was typically, in the British colonies, typically a volunteer, maybe 2, maybe more, depending on the population, who would walk around at dusk and light the candles in the thing, and then they would kind of patrol, and they would look for, hurry kids off to bed who were out too late or past their curfew, and they would watch for fire and things like that. And it was all reactive policing. It was, I'm a peacekeeper. I'm here to take care of things and help people out. And then in the South, the Southern police were begat by slave enforcement. The first police in the Southern states were hired hands, by plantation owners, and their goal oftentimes was just to prevent insurrection, because that was always a threat. And a lot of the racial violence follows immediately rumors about insurrection. It's almost always the case, especially if the violence is widespread. The slaves are going to revolt. Oh no. And the whites would just act out of fear, and they would kill people. There were cases south of Kentucky in eastern Tennessee, where valid reports of white people beheading and putting the heads of Black people on poles as a message to others that there will not be insurrection on this plantation. So the slave patrol, which is what they were called, would go, and they had every right to go into Black homes, unannounced, uninvited, to gather up any kind of thing that could be perceived as weapons, to break up church services. Any time that Blacks congregated, they could, tell them to all go home. They'd stop you on the street and demand to see your papers. Does this sound familiar? Because we still live with this. This is how it still happens. The ACLU concluded a long study about seatbelt violations in the state of Florida. It's like 60% of seatbelt violations went to African Americans. It's because police are stopping them to search their cars for drugs. This is, it's been with us for a very long time. I can't even remember what the question was, but that weird rabbit hole into policing was fascinating to me because I had I'd never thought about that before, how it could be different in the North and the South, but it's not all that long ago. And while I was reporting on this story and while I was meeting with Anthony Dinning in Louisville, eating at a Brazilian steakhouse, there are Black Lives Matter protesters marching outside demanding justice after the death of Brianna Taylor, who was a nurse. I haven't seen evidence to suggest otherwise, but she was wrongly killed in a misguided raid of her apartment. Police were looking for a boyfriend who might have been suspected of doing drugs, but wound up shooting and killing an innocent woman in her own bed. And, goodness gracious, I'm with the grandson while this is going on outside of the windows of the Brazilian steakhouse. I'm sitting with the grandson of George Dinning. This nobody knows his name, but he is, in my mind, an icon and an early civil rights leader, predating all the, in many ways more courageous than a lot of the people that we celebrate. I'm not suggesting we don't celebrate them. I'm just saying that level of courage was really something. So sorry, I got misguided.
Ben, did anything come of the research that you did with the police shootings in Florida?
Yes, ma'am. I wrote a story called Why Cops Shoot. And I try to answer that question. Like, why does this happen so frequently? Why are 40% of Black people, why are Black people so much more likely to be shot by police than white people in Florida? And what we did, we took all the information we could from all those reports, because we wound up having, 828 full, thorough, sometimes 100-page reports of investigations into police shootings. And by the way, out of 831, there was never a single case that was not found justified. There was never charges brought against police. In fact, if you shot and missed, you were more likely to be charged with a crime than if you shot and killed someone if you're a police officer in Florida. That is wild to me. But anyways, so we wrote this story and got into what's going on in the brain at the time, and talked to a bunch of psychologists about how humans respond to immediate threat, and how perceived bias plays into that, and unknown bias plays into that, and all that. So the story was I thought it was pretty good. And we built a big database that used all that data. So you could say now 831 people in these 6 years, 130 a year. And then we mapped them. Here's, there's dots on the map for every time somebody was shot. And then you can go to the dot and see what the trends were in that shooting, and built this big complicated database for it, and won some awards. And I don't know if it changed anything at all, but it was an interesting project and a worthy project, one I remain proud of.
So you don't know if it changed any policy?
No, I don't know that it changed any policy, but we held up a shining example in the state of Florida, a guy named Mike Chitwood, who actually came from Philadelphia. He was a detective at Philly, and he took over as the police chief of Daytona Beach Police Department. Daytona is where a couple of times a year, tens of thousands of Harley Davidson bikers get together and drink beer. And it's, of course, home to the Daytona Speedway. So you got a big NASCAR contingent that's coming into town on a regular basis. And it's a tendency to be a violent place. And this guy took over and reduced police shootings significantly. And he did so by sort of reforming the police department. And he said, we brought, when I first got here, my guys were responsible for doing, let's say, 8 hours a month in the range shooting, learning how to shoot. And he said, 97% of police officers never take their gun out of their holster. Why do we need to spend so much time training these guys to shoot? Let's train them how to talk, how to communicate with human beings, how to read body language, how to be polite, how to be courteous. how to disarm with your words. So they started doing all this verbal training and de-escalation training, and the numbers of police shootings dropped very quickly. With that and with the accountability of body cameras and things like that. Anyways, we held up Chitwood kind of as an example of like the new sort of more progressive police chief. And he got elected as sheriff of Volusia County, which is probably a top 10 most populated county in the state of Florida, and has since had success reforming the sheriff's office. So, that has an effect, I guess. Maybe other people saw him and thought, oh, we should be doing that too. One outfit that's the oldest police training outfit in the United States, Calibre Press, I think, something like that. Their founder emailed me and said, we're so often police and police training, and so we're so often misunderstood by the media that, you roll your eyes when you read some of these stories. And he was like, I really appreciate this story. Like, you've told our side of it without us sounding defensive. And it was just the notion that, so much is lost in a circumstance where there are two people, in the dark of night facing one another. And one is holding a flashlight. The other person can't he's blinded by the flashlight, can't see the facial expression of the police officer. And so oftentimes you're making assumptions about tone of voice, and these things you're processing them in a nervous state, and you're doing it very quickly. And if he says, take your seatbelt off and get out of the car, and you reach like this and he shoots you dead, that's it. You make that mistake in that tense situation, and the police officer can think, oh, he was going for a gun, and be justified in thinking that. So these situations are always very hairy, but the guy at Calibre Press was complimentary, and he said he was going to start using some of what we reported in his training. I don't know if he ever did or what portion that would have been, but I was glad just to better understand it, from all the different angles. And also we did a 2-part podcast with a very popular radio show out of New York City, out of their NPR channel called Radio Lab. I don't know if y'all get that there, but yeah, they did a great job with, they just kind of followed me around as we met some of the women that I was talking about and told some of their stories, and made it a 2-part podcast. I think it's called Shots Fired.
Ben, I have a question in regards to the writing process that you had for this book. How long did it take? How was your research going? I mean, I know there are a lot of, people interested in the writing process itself. So if you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. This was unique for me in that all 3 of my previous books, 2 of them I did while I was working full time at the newspaper. And so the book work and the travel to report and research and so forth, that was all built into like nights and weekends, and vacation, which was a really challenging way to do things. And I spent all my vacation time one year, like 2.5 weeks in the Philippine Islands, trying to chase down people who knew Josefina Guerrero, who was a spy for the U.S. during World War II. Anyways, so The Man That Walked Backward, I first sold that when I worked at the paper, and then finished writing it after I had left the paper. And this one I have reported and wrote without any other real job. I did teach a class or 2 at the University of Montana and at the University of South Florida, but the workload was just much lighter, so it was way better. And I turned in the proposal in November of 17, I think. And is that right? I turned in the proposal. No, sorry, November of 18. And then I turned in the first draft of the manuscript in December of 19. So I had already done a little bit of the work to write the proposal, let's say 2 or 3 months of work. So total of about maybe a little less than 1.5 years from proposal or idea to first draft of the manuscript. And then you go through line edits with the editor, and there's a lot of revision, and then you go through copy edits, and that takes another 6 months or so. And then you're hands off. You don't have anything to do with it. And you start focusing on trying to sell it and trying to get your name in the newspapers and all that stuff. And somebody else takes care of the printing, and then a box shows up at your door. And that whole process, about 2 years, 2.5 years sometimes. For me, that's how it's been. I had a book in April of 14, October of 16, December of 18, and this was January of 20. So about a little more than 2 years in between those. And my division of time, about 70% is dedicated to, so 70% of that 1.5 years would be research, interviews, digging through archives, all that stuff. And I leave about 30%, which often is about maybe 4 months, to the actual writing. And that comes at the very end. Like, I need to know the whole story and have all the material before I can start writing. And I sit down and write. I set a goal of about 1,000 words a day, and miss that a lot, but some days where I catch up. But if I can do 1,000 words a day without taking a break, then I'm done with a good first draft in 70 days. So, a book of 300 pages, about 70,000 words. And so I've done that a couple of times. I've hit that deadline, doing 70,000 words in about 70 days, leaving about 20 days or 3 months total to revise and send it out to friends for feedback and things like that. And this one, I had the great fortune, because I didn't have a job except writing the books. I had the great fortune of checking into the Seelbach Hotel in downtown Louisville on 4th Street, and hanging out there as I tried to write the first draft of this book. And they say that F. Scott Fitzgerald got his inspiration for Gatsby from hanging out at the Seelbach. Then he would go and get drunk at the bar and meet these interesting people, and they became the characters in Gatsby. Yeah. I never saw his ghost, though. I don't think he inspired me very much. I think it was just sitting down in a chair until you were so sick to death of staring at the screen that you had to write something. Well, you guys are fantastic. I don't know if there are any more questions, but this has been a real blast. And they tell me they have some books and book plates there at the bookstore. I hope they have book plates. I sent them a couple of days ago. So if anybody's interested, A Shot in the Moonlight.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. Well,
And at the library.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to say the library has all 4 of Ben's books. So, if you...
And you know what? There are probably 2 places in the world that have all 4 of Ben's books, the Orcas Island Library. And I only know this because I was there about 2 months ago in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. There's a place called the Book Emporium / Moon Pie Outlet. And it has books and moon pies. And they had all 4 of my books. And that never happens. I was like, this is heaven. Moon pies and all my books in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee.
That's
Well,
pretty...
the Tampa Library must have your books too, right? I'm sure they have all 4 at the Tampa.
Probably so.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks, Ben, for your time and your insights and skills.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
sounds a little bit like someday you should write a book about how you wrote your books. There seem to be some interesting stories there too.
Yeah. Let me get a few more under my belt, and then a few more successful ones under my belt. Or Grandma Gatewood's Walk this is my book. My first book is like this happens, right? what did shoot, Catcher in the Rye, Salinger.
Salinger.
He followed that with Frankie and Zoe
Frankie and
and some
Zoe,
other,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, and in case the others don't know, Grandma Gatewood's Walk is this story about a lady in her 60s who gets it in her head to through hike the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah.
And becomes the first woman, or at least the first woman in her 60s,
First
to have
woman.
done so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating story.
This has been great, Ben. Thank you so much. Can't wait to read the book now.
Thank you so much. I hope I didn't tell too much. I always do that. I just tell the whole dang story and nobody wants to read the book.
I was going to ask you where the family was during all of his sojourn from Bowling Green to Louisville. And no. Don't want to give that away. I'll find out when I read the book.
Yeah, there's an interesting story about how they made it to Indiana too, that has been passed down through the years. So that I thought that was a fascinating piece of it.
Yeah, and I feel duty bound to say that Diane Craig, who was here earlier and then bowed out, she put something in chat wanting us to say that it was great to see you, Ben, because she used to be your colleague at the Tampa Bay Times, right?
Oh yeah, how nice.
Yeah, so anyway, thanks again, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
Yeah.
okay,
Thank you very much.
what would
Nice
we do without Zoom these days, huh?
That's right. Right. Hope to see y'all in person soon.
Yeah,
Take
that would
care.
be nice.
Thanks, Ben.
Take care.
Thank you.
Got it.